Welcome to the Technology Pulse podcast, hosted by Daily Computers, providing comprehensive technology solutions to the public and private sectors for more than 35 years. This episode is brought to you by Scale Computing, providing highly automated edge infrastructure, virtualization platform, and hyper-converged solutions that can handle all your IT infrastructure needs. And now here's your host, Rick from Daily.
Welcome to the Daily Technology Pulse. This is Rick from Daily, and today we are talking with Alan Conboy, and Alan is the field CTO for Scale Computing. Alan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, happy to do it, and been looking forward to having this chat with you, Rick.
Yes, I've been looking forward to it as well. So, Alan, I always like to fill in people who may or may not know about Scale.
A long story short, what Scale Computing, those of us here at Scale set out to do was to create infrastructure that you don't need to be a VCP and a CCNE and a SNIA certified storage engineer. The makes virtualization containers infrastructure, if you will, approachable by anybody, and more importantly, affordable to everybody. Done in a way that self-heals, self-load balances, that you can manage tens of thousands of sites from one guy at one browser with one mouse and one mouse click while enjoying your morning cup of coffee.
Really, to borrow something from an old advertising campaign, you guys have kind of installed the easy button here, right?
We have, but it's a funny thing how difficult it can be to make something so complex as infrastructure easy. Requires a shocking amount of work, but we spent a better part of a decade doing just that. This is going to sound like hyperbole, Rick, but it's not. There's literally videos running around out there on the old interwebs, on YouTube and such, of a 4-year-old little girl standing up a Scale cluster, carving off VMs, setting up live migration. It doesn't get any easier or simpler than that.
Now, one of the things you and I are going to talk about today is the fact that, when you're talking about this infrastructure, and you're particularly talking about the SLED market, state and local government, education, both K-12 and higher ed, you're really looking at the fact that solutions that have been offered to these types of organizations were not designed for those types of organizations. Is that true?
That's 100% true. Here's the thing. If you take a look at how we got to where we got to with virtualization, actually take a look at the history of it, not only will you discover that it wasn't designed for folks that actually need it the most, okay? But it wasn't really designed per se at all. It was an amalgamation that started out as a science project in the mid-90s in the university space, in the .edu space, of, hey, can we take the concepts from the mainframe space, multiple air quotes machines, and can we port that into the x86 space? Well, that was done, and that eventually merged into becoming the company we all know and love-hate, VMware. Fast forward a few years, and what you discover was all of these other problems that came along with that. Suddenly, instead of you lost a power supply, you lost your file server, you wound up with you lost a power supply. That meant you lost your file and print, and you lost your domain controller, and you lost, because the storage silo problem, right? So what did the industry do? We originally repurposed old multi-home SCSI, from the database space to solve that. Okay? So that you could lose this power supply and everything would hop over to this other machine and keep on trucking. That was arguably the killer app of virtualization infrastructure as it was. But man, that brought roaring back all of the cost and complexity that made people want to get into virtualization in the first place. It kind of killed that. But that high availability and fault tolerance made it kind of worth it. Well, what you see when you look at the infrastructure space over the last 2 decades was this kind of layering on of different technologies from different technology domains to solve point problems throughout the evolution of virtualization. Heck, I would argue that containerization is just an extension of that exact same mentality. So what we here at Scale did was the one thing that had never ever been done in the infrastructure space before, especially the virtualization space. We took a clean sheet of paper to how infrastructure, virtualization, etc., should have worked in the first place. Got rid of everything that didn't really need to be there and put the remaining pieces, the stuff that really should be there, where it should have been all along, and then made it self-managed, self-load balance, self-healing. We implemented the concept known as state machines to literally implement AI before AI was even really a buzzword, a decade and a half ago, so that anybody could actually implement infrastructure, but not spend all their time bolting it together and trying to manage a Rube Goldberg machine. Now, when you talk about SLED, Rick, which is what led to this, you know what you got in the SLED space? A whole lot of guys with a whole lot of tight budgets that are working their butt off to try and keep infrastructure going when that infrastructure was never designed for the kind of challenges and needs that you find in that state and local and educational space. What those guys need is infrastructure that they don't have to think about. A cloud-like experience, only without the finger trap that is the cloud. Easy to get into, impossible to get out of, and oh, by the way, it's going to get real expensive. What we have built is purpose-built for that SLED space, for that state and local, for the SMB, for the mid-market folks, for all of the guys that were largely overlooked by the big V. See, when they built their infrastructure platforms out, they didn't build it for those of us in the real world. They built their infrastructure platforms for the hallowed halls of the Fortune 50, for the guys that have fleets and fleets of HP DL380 G10s, G11s, enough Enterprise Plus licensing to sink a battleship, so on and so forth. A pile of EMC symmetrics. That's all well and good and great for the Fortune 50 crowd on the island. Those of us in the real world, we need something that just works. You don't have to think about that. You're not giving up anything, but you're getting stuff back, like your white weekends, your nights.
And this is a common complaint that we at Daily have heard from our customers, is that a lot of the solutions, a lot of the technology solutions that are out there were designed for organizations where they have huge staffs or they have vast amounts of funding, where they could go into a vendor or an OEM with a blank check and say, we need this done. That's one of the biggest jokes in the world. It's amazing how fast things can be accomplished when you say money is no object. But for SLED, money is an object. Money's constantly an object. Budgets are constantly stretched.
Oh, yeah.
And there's only so many bake sales they can hold.
It's funny that you were talking about, those unlimited manpower and so on and so forth there. That, the very large enterprise, as I called them a few minutes ago, the hallowed halls of the Fortune 50, right? What you find when you go into, state of, county of, city of, when you look at the guys doing the hard work there, you don't find guys that have 36 acronyms on their business card, VCP and CCNE and SNIA certified X, Y, and Z. You find guys that say sysadmin, who are trying to do their level best to keep all of these technology domains that have kind of been duct taped together over 20 some odd years, working in something vaguely resembling harmony and giving up their spare time to do it. That's what happens when you get stuck with an infrastructure that was never designed for you. I mean, look at it this way, Rick. Let's say you want to build a deck on the back of your house. You need to run over to Home Depot, get a pile of lumber, right? To follow the legacy method to do that, you'd have to go jump in your car, drive over to the truck rental place, or better yet, you look out in your driveway, you don't have an F-150. You've got a Peterbilt, and you've got to diesel fill that thing up, work your way through town in this monstrous truck, load up your lumber, and drag it back. Horrifically excessive way to do things. Whole lot easier to jump in your F-150. Using the tool that's built for what your needs are, it's all the difference in these guys' lives. That's why we have such a massive presence in the sled space. Folks have discovered that, man, this just makes my life easier.
And, you're talking about looking out and seeing, okay, I'm going to load up the lumber in my F-150, but what happens when you have a smart car?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? When you've got yourself a little smart car and you actually need to accomplish more than it's designed for, that's kind of like the guy that's trying to run the entirety of his infrastructure on a 10-year-old box that happens to have the Hyper-V roll enabled. He's just crossing his fingers and praying that the load of lumber he dumped on the roof of that, to follow through on the analogy, it doesn't collapse the chassis.
And that's a very real concern too. Again, when you're talking about the people who are running these things, I love the fact that you say that these are people that typically don't have all those acronyms after their names. And the education space and the government space, this is usually where people have that upward trajectory where they start in a little cubicle and then eventually work their way into an office over the years. And obviously they do get training, but you're not pulling all of the folks and all of the resources that are available in the private sector. You're not pulling those into the public sector very often, or you're pulling them in at a level where, again, they have to grow into a role rather than come in at a much higher level. Is that a challenge when you're looking to implement and bring on the scale solution?
It's interesting. Those are the guys that see value much faster than the guys that have a fiefdom to protect, so to speak. You're talking about the educational space here, right? So I'll give you a great example. I have been in so many school districts. Just talking to folks, I love to take time to go meet customers, prospective customers, and look at what's going on in the world so that I'm making sure that we're staying on track against what folks are actually going to need. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to the guy that runs IT for these school districts in Kansas or in Jersey and all of these other places where that air quotes sysadmin, and I don't mean that in a bad way, he's really the PE coach who essentially is moonlighting to help the district to keep a small data center up and going in the back of the library at the local high school to supply infrastructure out to the district so that they could run Blackboard and A+ and a handful of other things along with file and print, etc. That guy, not only is he absolutely reliant on vendor support, 100%, he didn't ever set out to want to be a sysad or a head of IT. It's just a role that needed doing, and he was willing to step up. And we see that repeated time and time again in the educational space, where it's not necessarily a case of somebody who was dying to be in high tech, but it's somebody who's just cares enough about education and making things work for the district so that education can happen for the students. That guy, I've got a solution. And it's an infrastructure that he can go from knows nothing about it to it's running in 15, 20 minutes without needing a ton of ongoing career education, so to speak. That when a power supply goes up in smoke or a cable gets kicked out, the infrastructure just recognizes that, automatically works around it, so that it's not a hair on fire issue that he's spending Thanksgiving Day tied to technical support on a telephone trying to figure out what went wrong.
Right. And that is the truth. It's usually not only Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong, but it will happen at the least opportune time.
Oh, absolutely. Things will break on the least convenient moments possible. Nothing ever decides, I think I've had enough fun and goes up in smoke on a Tuesday at, 10 in the morning. That's just not the way things break.
No, it never is. You touched on something that I'd like to get back to, and we talk about, we have the personnel, like we said, that are growing into roles, and they're really growing into the roles because they're stepping up. So then you also have the folks who are making the decisions, and one of the big decisions, the concern about, okay, so what is the changeover? What is the implementation? What are some of the typical situations that you're seeing if somebody said, okay, I no longer want to look at a 10-year-old box. I want to go to this much different type of solution where I have all of this flexibility and I can do it with one person from one machine.
Sure.
What is the time frame that you're really looking at?
For what that legacy approach to infrastructure that these guys have been having to deal with for forever, for what that costs at just one site, bringing in the servers, the switches, the hypervisor licensing, the backup licensing, the shared storage platforms, and so on and so forth, for what that costs by itself, not inclusive of the fact that support for those infrastructures are on a sliding scale, and by the time you hit year 4 with that, you could damn near replace the whole thing for what they want for another year of support. For what that beast costs just to implement at day 1, I can put a cluster in site A, a cluster in site B, have real-time replication with failover and failback in between them without needing any additional licensing whatsoever, and still have enough money left over on the delta between those two infrastructure approaches to, if you'll pardon the term, back the beer truck up to the garage and enjoy cases of Heineken for the next 5 years. That's a huge difference from a budgetary perspective. Now, the other question, the other point we wanted to touch on there was, what does it look like to move from, say, a VMware or a Hyper-V environment or any of several others into a scaled platform? And it is ridiculously simple. You can do anything from natively import the virtual hard drives from the legacy platform, right? That ability to import foreign VMs to us that's been something that's been there since day 1. But we also took the time to take that a step further and have something called HC3 Move, little agent-based. Drop an agent into the source machine, the legacy workloads that you're wanting to pull over, and that guy will reach into the scale cluster, create the VMs, and while everything's up and running, move all of the data structures over, all on its own without any downtime, so that you've got this thing mirrored up, ready to go. And then we'll automatically, simultaneously shut down the old one without changing it in any way and start the new one. The only outage that happens there is the length of time of a boot. That's it. At no point in time did you have to go in and poke this or tweak that or any of that silliness.
And that really is a big concern for people because, again, it's daunting. Usually people are worried about one site, but to do multiple sites, you sit there and start thinking, this is months, this is pulling people off of other projects, and it appears that you're simplifying that.
Radically simplifying. And that's just what we've been doing for forever. Literally, that's what we've been doing here at Scale for well over a decade. Okay? But let's talk about the next iteration of this. This is stuff that we've released over the last year. You talked about multiple sites. Well, city of, county of, SLED implementations, they tend to be multiple sites. Well, what if you could literally point a browser at a single management plane, have all of your sites right there, all the way down to the individual workload level, be able to click directly through to any of them without needing VPNs or without needing any of that silliness. Now let's take that one step further. What if you didn't have to do anything other than supply IP addresses to implement those clusters at those sites? What if literally the gear could ship directly to this office and that office and this office over here, and somebody could walk in, plug in an Ethernet cable, hit a power button, walk away. And those nodes, those individual scale nodes, would wake up, grab a DHCP assigned IP, talk to the cloud management plane, fleet manager, discover who they're supposed to be, configure themselves, form their own clusters, reach back into that management plane and say, hey, I'm ready Run your run books against me, send me the workloads I'm supposed to have, and have that happen automatically too. Because that's not a what if or an imagine if you will. That's stuff we're doing right now today. That zero touch provisioning across hundreds or thousands of sites, that's also part of what you get with scale.
You're talking about a solution that is growing.
Oh, yeah.
Same complaint that we get again is, well, sure, this is what you've been doing for the past decade, but how are you keeping up, or what's the next thing? And so knowing that there is future vision, and you're again looking at how your customers are changing, at how organizations are changing, at how methods are changing, and looking at the technology that's available and then implementing that into these solutions.
Oh, yeah. I'll give you a great example of that. We, as I'm sure you're aware, Rick, we have a very, very tight relationship with Intel. And starting, about 5 years ago, we started working directly with Intel on designing with them their Enterprise Edge Compute Edition, powered by Scale Computing. The reason that we can do that is because our entire top to bottom stack, the storage stack, cluster orchestration stack, management stack, DR stack, everything, hypervisor itself, fits in as little as a gig of RAM.
You said a gig.
That allows a gig, yes. Now, that allows us to bring our entire stack into devices so small they'll fit in your pocket and leave the lion's share of resources available for running workloads, whether that's containers, Docker, and so on and so forth, or individual virtual machines, or a mix of all of the above. That, when you think about looking forward, what does the hardware do? Well, the hardware gets smaller, faster, more capable, and uses less power. Heck, I've got a Intel NUC sitting here on my desktop that will, in every single way, outrun one U-Gear from 4 years ago, but does it while consuming a whopping total of 45 watts. Our ability to take our entire platform stack into these new and future-looking appliances, there's something that's absolutely unique to Scale. And that means that you can put the compute right where it needs to be, rather than be focused exclusively or very heavily on interconnection between locations.
And really, that equation, you're talking about less space, you're talking about less power, you're
less heat.
You're going down the line of reduction,
but without giving up capability. This tiny little box, 4 inches square, that I was just mentioning, sitting here on my desktop, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's got 20 some odd cores per node, each of which, that the processor and the thing will, push itself out to about 4.5, 5 gigahertz, right? It happens to be running my domain controller, VDI implementation, file and print, a couple of application servers, on a little 3-node cluster of devices that I literally can grab and run out the door with if the building catches on fire.
Just pick it up and go.
You're spot on, right? You can literally shove them in your pockets and out the door you go. Talking about future looking, that future's here right now.
And that's everything. That's the kit and caboodle. Yeah. That used to be racks upon racks of stuff.
I've got a 3-node cluster of HE150. I actually happily retired about a 5.5-year-old 1U 3-node cluster of gear and migrated it entirely onto 3 of those HE150. All of the workloads, all of the VMs, etc. And my power consumption has gone from about, call it 450, 500 watts per node to about 45.
90% reduction in power consumption and no reduction in capability.
No, they got faster. That's just it. Those little boxes, they're all NVMe. 100%. But the price point on that little beastie is a fraction of what a 1U was 3-4 years ago.
It seems like this really is just something that is tailor-made to these organizations where they're dealing with old technology, inefficient technology, struggling to try to keep up, struggling to try to find the manpower. And yet it all comes into I hate to say it this way because it almost sounds too good to be true, but it's a nice, tidy little package.
It's okay to say it that way if it's 100% true, and it absolutely is. But the best part, Rick, is you don't have to take a single word I've said as gospel here. Talk to any of the thousands of scale customers out there. They'll all tell you the exact same thing. It's funny when you think about not just SLED, but retail and, what do all these places have in common? Where life happens is not inside the four walls of the data center, right? I don't know about you, but I've never signed a contract inside the four walls of a data center. I've never built a new road inside the walls of a data center, so on and so forth, right? Life happens out there in the world. And while, scale absolutely has, core data center infrastructure, when you start talking about pulling together all of the pieces that we've talked about so far here today, that scale's happily been doing for years and is currently doing, suddenly that you can almost taste the paradigm shift.
And we're happy to lead that charge because, again, we recognize that these organizations are looking for new solutions. They're looking for different solutions. They're looking for ways to save money. And, because in the capitalist society, they always say you have to spend money to make money. But government organizations, educational institutions don't make money. They spend money. They, they provide services. And so giving them the opportunity to, again, make this shift.
Leverage the same efficiency that you find in the public sector or in the private sector, but do in a way. I mean, show me the school district in modern America that is one site, one location. There isn't one anymore.
No, the one-room schoolhouses are gone.
Long since. Well, what if you're able to put infrastructure at every one of those sites without having to run around to any of those sites and networking to that school over there, this school over here drops? Well, so what? Everything keeps running internal to it. Now, that's why you find scale sitting on ships in the ocean. You don't have to have always-on connectivity. It's completely autonomous.
And that becomes a challenge in itself, where again, you're always talking about connectivity and when things go down, because that's the other thing that we've heard, because we love our data. Everything is wonderful about technology until it doesn't work. And once your internet provider goes down for maintenance, or a crew hit a cable, or somebody took out a pole, that's when things suddenly get ugly. And so that's not an issue for scale.
No, it's not. That's the beautiful part. If you pushed everything into Azure, so to speak, or Amazon, which everybody ran and did for about 7 years then, right? Because they wanted out of that Rube Goldberg machine that was legacy infrastructure. So they went and pushed all these workloads up to cloud. Well, you've got all the costs associated with that. But more importantly, if you lost connectivity because, somebody trenched through a line or hit a pole, you had zero accessibility to not just your data, but your runtime, et cetera. Right? Well, the difference here is we take that same set of workloads without charging for ingress and egress and how much it's your gear, you own it, right? And put it directly into the locations where you need it, and it's able to run completely autonomously. So the kids in all 60 classrooms, they're still up and running and doing their thing. And that's just the educational space. When you take a look at, state of, how many state of entities across these 50 states of ours have one location? None of them. They've got offices and buildings for this and that spread across the state. It's the same concept.
And it's that convergence that really sets scale apart.
It's funny. I was in a meeting, oh, good Lord, 12 years ago now, with a man by the name, he's an analyst, but he's now retired, a man by the name of Arun Tanaja. And we were showing him some of our original prototypes for the scale computing platform. And in that meeting, and I remember it because it's 13 hours of my life I will never get back, Arun coined a term specifically to describe what we were doing. You mentioned a word, convergence. Well, the term that he coined in that meeting all those years ago, specifically to describe the scale computing platform, was a term called hyperconvergence, hyperconverged infrastructure. That's where it actually came from. That's where the term HCI came from, was specifically to describe what we were doing by Arun. That's where that came from. I really wish we had copyrighted it back then. I'm moderately sure I saw a hyperconverged toaster the other day. But what we've done is taken that where hyperconverged, where the other guys that kind of glommed onto the term after us, we've taken it where they can't even go, where their stacks won't even begin to fit.
And obviously, anybody who's looking for this type of technology, anybody who's looking for hyperconvergence, not toasters, we don't do toasters, but anybody who's looking for hyperconverged solutions when it comes to their infrastructure, this is obviously somewhere where Daily and Scale can help. And we're always willing to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
This is right in our wheelhouse of how we provide technology solutions, not just products, but we provide solutions to try to help our customers.
It's great that you mentioned the term solutions there, Rick. And you're right. We love our partnership with Baylor. But when you talk about solutions, nobody wakes up and says, hey, I want a new piece of hardware. Nobody, not a single sysadmin who's doing it for, to keep things moving forward does that. They wake up and they go, man, I really need a solution for my workforce to be able to work remote, or I need a solution that really guarantees backup while defending against malware, defending against ransom. They think in terms of solutions. So one of the biggest focused areas of Scale for the last 5 years has been really fleshing out the ecosystem around the Scale computing platform so that you've got an entire suite by vendors that of solutions that can all come together to fit that solution need that Daily delivers to their customers. And that ecosystem continues to grow.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up this episode?
I'll give you one. And it's more for the guys in the field, the guys on the front lines and in the trenches at at those sled locations. The guys out on the foundry floors, et cetera, that are doing their best just to make things continue to go. But when you've got infrastructure challenges, we've got a better way. It's going to give you your time back. It's going to save you a ton of money on the budget. That's just going to work so that you can concentrate on things that make the business better, that make the county run better, and not have to spend your time focusing on what broke where. That's what Scale's really all about at the end of the day. We can help you.
And that's that daunting thing, again, like you said, getting up in the morning and not having to worry about what's potentially going to break on me today.
Yeah.
All right, Alan, thanks again for joining the Technology Pulse. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Technology Pulse podcast produced by Daily. Before we go, we would like to remind you of a few legal considerations. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Daily or its leadership. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide legal, financial, or other professional advice. The content of this podcast is protected by copyright laws and may not be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted without the written permission of Daily Computers Inc. Any products, services, or other references mentioned in this podcast are for informational purposes only, and do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Daily. Thank you again for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at marketing@daily.com.